Estás viendo Canal América, televisión dominicana para el mundo.
Sometimes life can be so damn hard. You don't know where to go. Everything keeps falling apart. Try to do your best, but only God knows that you've given everything you've got, but the world takes you down. You just keep moving on. Let your fears.
Welcome to A Time for Truth show. I'm your host, Dr. Bernard Fialkoff, and it's a real pleasure to be back with you again tonight on our show. And before we start, a lot of you have been asking, how do you get the previous episodes that we've had over the last few years? Because we've covered so many different topics, from nutrition, drugs, human rights, real estate, art, music, investing, really so many topics. So here's how you do it. You go on YouTube on A Time for Truth show, and you click on the subscribe, and you can become a member and receive all the previous episodes and get information that will help to change your life, which is the purpose and mission of A Time for Truth show, to bring stability in a time of chaos. And let's talk about that. What's happened in our world? Why is it that so much has seemed to be out of control? Why is it so hectic where it seems like there's not enough time in a day? The stress level is so high, and the suicide rate very high, and the deaths from drugs, which obviously are people seeking to lessen their stress. Unfortunately, they turn to drugs. But what are they trying to do when they do that is lessen their stress. And when you think about the fact that 106,000 Americans died in 2021 from drug overdose, it's a very high figure. Too high. Why is it too high? Because in the entire Vietnam War of 10 years, we lost 58,000 Americans. And now, in only 1 year, a tenth of that time period, we lose twice as many Americans. Why? And alcoholism, which has increased almost 50% globally because of the stress of COVID. And then you get to problems of who to believe. Who can you really count on? I hear so many of my friends say to me, you know, it doesn't surprise me what I found on this YouTube, Twitter, Instagram. I got an email the other day, the news, Fox, CNN, whatever. And they don't know what to believe. They don't know what's true. And so what are we dealing with? What is the root of this problem? How do we solve it? Well, it's something called help. Sincere help. Honest help. Versus the opposite. Betrayal. Treason, lies, people taking us down a path which doesn't really lead where we are promised. You have them going down a path that leads to heartbreak, where they lose their investment, their hard-earned dollars. Why? Because someone else decided to use the technology that we have nowadays but not for a good cause, for a malevolent, personal, selfish reason. And we say, well, that's the way the world is, which is already another indicator of the degradation of our communities, our nations, our planet. Why? Because we don't have trust. We don't have honest help. We have treason and betrayal. Let's go over a few examples of how this could be. Let's say that you ran your own business. And let's make it during COVID. This is a real time. And so you're trying to run your business. You're trying not to go bankrupt. You're trying to keep solvent. And most of you have realized that so many different companies have gone belly up. They've lost their solvency and they've gone into debt. And then they end up going to bankruptcy, or maybe they don't bother. They just shut their doors and they give up. Why? Well, let's take the example that I was getting into. Here we are in COVID, and let's say that some of the employees decide that they're going to stay out. And maybe for truthful reasons, because COVID has done a lot of harm. And factually, that way. But how does an employer actually know whether or not the supposed tests that are positive or negative are really there? And you say, well, because the person has to show some type of certificate, and that's very true. But what if they don't want to? And then what happens if you have a few of your employees and that commonality? And then if you try to get them to do that, they say, well, you don't trust me. And you get, an antagonism. And you get a lack of harmony in that business. Or you finally get the results and you wonder when the result really came because you see the date is different. Or you see that they were actually fine in terms of the test days ago, but never returned to work. What happens? Let's just take the employer, because employers are people too. That employer will get very frustrated. That employer will develop a lack of trust. And that lack of trust, if it leads to an upset, that employer may start generalizing his upset. And what happens? Now he doesn't trust all his employees. Or maybe he wants to get new employees. But now when he goes and interviews them, he's already jaded. He doesn't know who to believe. Now, let's take a look at this now, and we'll go the reverse. And we'll get from an employee standpoint, where the employer decides, well, you know what? I've gotten my government subsidies, and, I'm going to just play this game. And so I'm going to cut back on my employees' hours and make the ones that I have work more hours. And so what happens is the employees themselves feel betrayed. Why do they feel that way? Well, because they've worked in that enterprise, many of them for many years, and now all of a sudden they have their hours reduced that they depend on. Or maybe he totally lets them go and they're out of work. And, when you have someone who has integrity and who wants to be productive and has a family to support, they need to work. And if they have pride in themselves, they don't want to go on a subsidy. It's like the story, of a championship boxer back, years ago, who during the Great Depression, and he had to go on the dole. And then he came around, Braddock, James Braddock, who became heavyweight champion, beating Max Baer. And he had to go on the dole. And he was not happy about it. And eventually continued with his boxing. And Did a Cinderella story. Why? Because he didn't want to be given a handout. Most people, they don't want a handout. They want to work. But when they lose faith in mankind, when they lose faith in the employer, they start losing faith. What can happen? They can start getting frustrated. We look at crime on the subway and we say, well, why is crime on the subway occurring? Oh, it's all the homeless people. Or it's just criminal. They're genetically criminal. There's a genetics causing them to be criminal. But if we take a look at the possibility of a lack of trust, and that this person may have one time actually been a productive citizen and was fired from their job, or couldn't make ends meet, couldn't get the help he wanted. Again, we get to help, honest help. Not just words, not just some fancy speech, but a program that would actually help them to get a vocation and a job that would be stable, of sufficient economic return, so they could really be able to survive and have their family survive. So let's say that they didn't get that. They start fighting with their wife because there's a lot of stress. They have 2 kids, and maybe things turn bad. Maybe he starts drinking. Maybe he starts taking drugs. Maybe she does. Maybe they both do. And what happens? They lose trust in each other because they start fighting with each other. And the love that they had turns into hate. And the hate turns into distrust. And now we have someone who has lost their dream. The person that they married. The kids that they had. They're depressed. And then maybe they do turn to alcohol or drugs because they can't confront their lives anymore. And if you could see that go on more and more and get more depressed and maybe turn to other types of drugs or lose themselves totally. And here you have now a criminal, someone who lost their ability to be productive, lost their morale because production is the basis of morale, and so became frustrated, became antagonistic, never got honest help, didn't feel anyone cared, went further and further down, started turning to the wrong solutions, started getting more frustrated, needed money, maybe commits a crime because they're hungry. It doesn't make it right, but we want to look at these things, because when we look at these things, what are we looking at? We're looking at a dissolution of trust, a treason of humanity. Why? Because if you really look at it, look at how much we receive each day. The lights that we get, the food that's brought to us from different countries, the security we get from living in a powerful, free country, the fact that someone goes to the bagel store and gets up at 5 in the morning to make you bagels, the fact that somebody has a coffee plantation somewhere in the world and has sent you to have coffee, and grows citrus in California, in Florida, in parts of the Caribbean, and sends it to the United States. So there's a collaboration, a coordination that occurs amongst all of us. And that has to have trust. What happens when the person who ships his citrus products to the United States has it held up at customs for some new reason, and his product spoils, and all his work goes down the tubes? Is he going to be happy? Is he going to develop an attitude toward the country that delayed the delivery of his product, of his service? It doesn't have to be food. It can be electronics. Look what happened recently where all of these cars couldn't be brought to the United States. Why? Because no one had thought of producing the chips that were necessary for these cars. And you say, well, that's something that could happen because of COVID. But let's take a look at that. Would you forget to go shopping at your supermarket? Would you forget to go to your pharmacy if you had high blood pressure and not get your antihypertensive medication for months? Not for a day, not for a few days. Let's be realistic. Those chips for the cars didn't run out in a day or two. And then someone will say, well, yes, that's because, you know, there was a slowdown, the people were out of work. Very good, but why was nothing done ahead of time? People start losing trust. They start losing faith that there's a planning, that there's a coordination. This is what happens in a business. When someone comes in, has an appointment, their appointment is not in the book. It can be an honest mistake, but they've taken off from their job. And now they've lost their time and they get angry. And then they're told that they can't be seen. And there's an upset between that office, that person. We can make it a medical office, a dental office, with a patient. So, where's that lack of trust and where's that lack of fidelity, confidence? Well, that was in the person who at that point had decided that it wasn't that important to pay attention. And you could say, well, yes, they were very stressed out and they were overworked. But then we're never going to get to a solution. And, you know, if we took a look at a place that we go to, many of us go to, the gymnasium, we go to exercise. There, when we go to exercise, there are no excuses. You exercise, you improve. You exercise improperly, you may get injured. You have to exercise properly, the right gradient, with nutrition. But how is it that you manage to do that? Because you care. So there, in essence, is something that's very important, caring. We need to care, not just about what we receive, not just about what we want, but we have to care about others. If for no other reason than your own survival, that's good enough as a start. Why do I say that? Because when we stop caring for each other and we start committing crime by robbing someone of their hard-earned work, how? By charging them too much for a service that's not valuable. How can that happen? You go to an auto mechanic, he fixes your car, he charges you too much, and the brakes malfunction, and he tells you it's something else. And it's not what he fixed, and you have to pay another $800. We don't want to have to pick on the auto mechanic. It could be at the grocery store. You buy food, and it goes bad. And the grocery doesn't want to stand behind it. And you feel, not only have you lost your money, but you don't have the time to go back to the grocery store. You're so stressed out already with driving to work, getting up early, trying to take care of your family, and paying bills, or maybe if you're the woman in the house with cooking, getting home. You know, everything is very tight in today's world. So how do we start? Where do we go? How do we solve this dilemma of lack of trust, of confidence, of helping? Well, what we do is we take a look and we really sit for a moment and add up all the different products, services, food products, water that we're getting from others. And you take a look what would happen if those others didn't exist. Where would you get your sustenance? If something happened to the water supply, which in some countries it happens. We're very lucky in the United States, but let's say we lived in a different country and the water supply became polluted or infectious. We would have no water supply. What if the sewer system in a city, and I was in a city, and I won't mention the name, where the sewer system has always been so bad that when you go to that country, it's a well-known fact, you drink water, bottled water. Why do you drink bottled water? Because if you drink the water in that city, you're going to get sick from bacteria and different microbes in that water. How do the people in that city feel that this problem is ongoing for so many years? Does that lead them to feel happy? Or are they frustrated and have a lack of trust in their government? And now if the government's solution is to use force, military might, police restrictions, then you have a society not only that doesn't trust each other, but is going to become violent. Or if not violent, will go into apathy. So the country no longer produces. And then we're trying to see how to stimulate the economy, how to get gross national production to increase. How can you do that when you're not taking care of your own citizens? There's an interchange that goes on daily. So let's break this down. Let's go all the way back down to the family unit. And let's, as individuals of that family unit, realize that our family unit gives us social interchange, gives us some joy, some happiness. Sure, there are moments that are difficult. Which one of us, when we were a teenager, didn't get into trouble? And which one of us, as a parent, hasn't done something a little more harshly than we wanted to? But the thing to realize is that those moments caused a lack of trust, a break in confidence, a break in that affinity, that warmth between us. So in order to reestablish that, we have to look at things with warmth. We have to take a look at the reality of what someone else gives us. It doesn't have to be monetary. It doesn't have to be something that we can see, such as food or clothing. It can be the simplicity of having somebody to speak to. Because if you really look at it and you had all the money in a city and you owned all the buildings and you were there with 100 other people, it would be very lonely indeed. You say, well, that's very drastic, Dr. Fialkoff, a very simplistic look at things. No, it's not simplistic. There's a saying that there's power in simplicity. And if we look at simplicity, we'll realize that we're dependent on each other as humanity. And when we lose that humanity, we break bonds. And what happens? You have what's going on with Ukraine and Russia, where over whatever reasons that they have, you have all of this warfare, destruction. We complain about it. We protest about it. But what happened earlier in time? There was a lack of humanity, probably in those leaders' homes. In other words, in the people who are leading our countries, in the examples that they had when they were 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years old. You say, well, what are we going to do? That's the way the world is now, Dr. Fialkoff. No, that's an attitude of a victim. That's an attitude of someone who's going to be a failure, who's never going to make it in life. We've got to take a look like a boxer who gets off the mat, gets back up, and somehow wins his fight, takes on the challenge, gets off the deck, and says, I'm going to do something about it. Because a lot of us are under a tremendous amount of stress, economically, time-wise. And even though we have all these tremendous gadgets, sometimes we're overwhelmed. We have too many emails, too much communication that we can't return. So let's go back to simplicity. Let's go back to human warmth, to humanity. Let's start that within our own homes. And let's realize that productivity is important. If someone doesn't plant an apple tree, there will be no apples. If we're only all going to eat the apples, there will be no trees. And if we cut them all down and make heat, we'll all starve to death. So it's important that we produce. And we produce in our homes, and that our kids produce by getting educated. And that we respect our kids, and they respect us. And that we make time for each other. And that we legislate, instead of for all these different things, that we look at the subway crime and we say, you know what? We better legislate so that our constituency in New York City can have time to eat a normal family dinner at 6 or 7 o'clock at night. And do an experiment. and see if that doesn't change the subway crime, and see if that doesn't change the warmth in the city and reduce the traffic as people start to live a more normal life? Are we looking at something that's like impossible to attain? No, but it starts with a decision. And that decision is something that comes within each one of us to decide, yes, you know what? There's a lot to do, but I'm going to be kind to my wife, to my husband, to my kids, and have them return the same to me. And then we're going to expect the same of others. And we're going to produce. We're not going to just ask and complain and criticize. We're going to produce, each one of us, because each one of us is a vital cog in this great country, in this great world. And by producing, we will all interchange. And when we interchange, there's pride in getting along, like there is when the Yankees win the World Series, or the Knicks or the Nets win the NBA championship. Teamwork, accomplishment, production. Sure, there's strife, but then there's a goal. And then we have the emotion. I hope that we apply this, we look at this, and we take it further. May these words inspire you and not just be some panacea or some simplistic, euphoric dream. It was a pleasure to speak to you. And someone once said, when we can fully trust each other, there will be peace on earth. Mr. Ron Hubbard. So may you have a happier life, and may we see a change in 2021, 2020, that'll occur in 2022. May this change happen in 2022. Thank you for viewing, and may this happen. Good night.
Sometimes life can be so damn hard. You don't know where to go. Everything keeps falling apart. Yeah. You try to do your best, but only God knows that you've given everything you've got, but the world takes you down. You just keep moving on. Let your feet